Alright, so now that we've got a chord progression and some drums going with this track, let's go ahead and start to add a bass line and a melody. Okay, let's start with a bass line because it's actually the simplest way to go. There's a couple different ways we could add a bass line. We could go into Live's instruments and go into Instrument Rack and look through the bass sounds, find one that we like, and play them like normal instruments. We could also dig into the ADSR pack, which has some 808s in it. And I really like that sample there. Let's see if it fits the mood of our track. The way we're going to use that sample to make it into a playable instrument, though, is via Live's instruments. We're going to use Simpler, which is actually a very funny name for it because it's a simple sampler, which is why it's called that. Important thing to point out before we go forward. Live automatically loads with 2 MIDI tracks, which we've used for our chords and for our drums. That's MIDI tracks. Then it also loads with 2 audio tracks. We've used one audio track for our hi-hat loop. You can see that's audio, very different from MIDI right here. Then we have a 4th audio track. We can't load a new instrument onto an audio track. An audio track is for recording in audio or using loops and sounds that are already audio, not MIDI. Simpler and these virtual instruments are all run via MIDI. So we can't drag Simpler onto this audio track. It will not let us. Instead, we could go to Create, insert MIDI track, or we can just drag our instrument here where it says Drop Files and Devices, and it'll create a 5th track for us. Since I'm not using this 4th audio track, I'm just going to delete it. Now we have just the Simpler instrument left, and you can see that it says drop sample here, because right now, even though it's armed, we get no sound because there's no sample in this Simpler at the moment. All right, so let's navigate back to the pack, go to that 808 sample that we like, and drop it in where it says drop sample here. Now when we play the keyboard, it's a little too low, let's bring it up. We can now play it as an instrument. But one thing we need to always check when we're sampling things like this is what is the root note. Because if that sample's original note is not a C, and we play a C on our keyboard, it's not going to sound right. It's not going to line up with our track. And an easy way to test this is to go to the audio effects and to find the tuner in Ableton Live. We put the tuner where it says drop audio effects and we play a note, we can see the note that this sample is playing, and we can very much see that it's an E. And if you've been paying attention, you know that the note I'm playing on the keyboard is a C. So we need to get those two things to match up. So if we go over to the Controls tab here, you'll see that there's a transpose button. And if we're at E and we need to get to C, we've got to transpose down. And since we already talked about whole steps and half steps, I should say another term for those is semitones. Another term for half steps is semitones specifically. So this distance right here, we called that 1/2 step earlier. It's also 1 semitone. That's a semitone. That's a semitone. So if you've been paying attention, you should know that we need to go down 1, 2, 3, 4 semitones to get to C. I could just type that number in right there. Minus 4 semitones. Boom. And now our sample is in tune, meaning the note that we play on the keyboard will be the note that we hear from the instrument. Okay, but now what? How do we make a good sounding bass line? Well, to do that, we're going to take a look at our chord progression. And since we were playing very simple triads that are all in root position, because we don't know anything else at this stage, we're just playing root position triads, we're actually going to take a look at the bass note of these triads. A, E, F, D. So let's go ahead and play that with our 808 and play along with the chord progression, remembering that each chord is held for 4 beats each. So I'm going to hold each bass note for 4 beats each and play along with the chord progression. Let's try it. A, 2, 3, 4, E, 3, 4, F, D. That's the simplest way, to be honest. Now let's go over looping this one more time. And since this is simple, I can play it with one hand, A, E, F, D. and I can hold them each for 4 beats. I'm going to have one hand on the mouse, which is going to help me click the record button. That's going to give me a 1 bar count in. It's going to count to 4. Then I start recording. And then when I get to the last note, right after I play that last note, I'm going to click the play button that appears here, and it's going to loop back for me in a perfect 4-bar loop. So let's try it. Record, 2, ready, go. A, 2, 3, 4. E, 2, 3, 4. F, 2, 3, 4. D, press play, 3, 4, let go. There it is. We've got our loop. We're going to do some quantize again because we see that we're a little bit off grid in a couple spaces. And one other thing that we're going to do is we're going to make these notes be perfectly lined up with the grid, first of all. We can talk about quantization settings, first of all, because if I go to Command-Shift-U, we get the quantization settings. We can change what rate it's quantizing at, which this is a pretty slow line here, so we can set it to eighths. And if we want it to 100% quantize, 100% lock up to the grid, we can change it to 100%. To have a little more drifty, floaty sound, you can bring that percentage down. So now that we're all linked up to the grid, we want these notes to start and end perfectly with each other. We don't want any gaps like that. Easy way to do this, because for 808s, we definitely don't want them overlapping like this. Could just cause muddiness in our mix. If we select all of our notes and we press this legato button, that will make them perfectly start and end without any overlap or any gap in between them. So now, we have a fairly simple 808 bass line, and following that root note, the root notes of the chords, is the safest way to go, and that's why we started with chord progressions there. If we wanted to get a little more advanced, we could use things like neighbor notes, meaning that if I'm going to play those basic notes, I know what my target note is, I know what note's coming up next. So what I could do instead is hold each note for 3 beats, and then on that 4th beat is play a note that's right next to the next note I need to play. So if the target is to go from A to E, I could instead go A, F, E, because it's right next to E. Or I could go D, E. See how those notes are neighbors? And if my target note is D, I can either go, I can play its neighbor note on that 4th beat. So let's record another loop, but let's use this concept of neighbor notes. And if we remember what we talked about with subdivisions, if we divide things into 8th notes, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, we can actually use that to our advantage here. So I'm going to actually play those neighbor notes on an and. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. Oh no, I didn't start looping. I didn't hit loop record. What happens? All right, let's stop, spacebar. And what happened was we ended up with a longer loop than we actually wanted. And that's okay, because we could fix it. You remember what we were doing, working in 4s, working in groups of 4s, not only just beats, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, but also in bars. That keeps everything even. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we went over to a 5th and a 6th bar, and if we let that play out, it'll sound good at first, but eventually when we get here, it's not going to line up with the rest of the track. So the first thing I want to do is actually delete this note that I played right on bar 5. Select it and press delete. And then I want to grab these flags right here, form a little bracket, and then pull it in, and we're going to pull it all the way into that downbeat. That next downbeat, we want this whole bar to be caught. And now, look, we're left with the same thing. This is a 4-bar loop. This is a 4-bar loop. We can just see the extra beyond the loop bars at this point. If we want to get rid of all that extra on the end here, we can right click on the loop and press crop clips. And now it looks nice and even. Let's go ahead and do the same techniques we've been doing, where we hit Command A and we hit Command U to quantize everything to the grid. And then we can also hit legato so that nothing overlaps and everything starts and ends perfectly. I do feel like we could play a slightly more advanced version of this bass line with what we've already talked about with drums, with playing more interesting rhythms, and then also with what we just talked about with neighbor notes. So let's go ahead and just try to play one more version of this that is just slightly more interesting. It is an 808 after all, so we can play a little more rhythmic bounce. Now, instead of doing the looping method where I have to have one hand on the mouse, let me just demonstrate again how we can double click in an empty clip slot. We start with a 1-bar loop, but if we hit duplicate and then duplicate again, we end up with a 4-bar loop. And I'm going to record into this empty clip here and play a little bit more fun of an 808 line. Ready, go. Now we are still in overdub mode. I need to make sure that I get out of overdub mode by clicking that record button again. And now, doesn't matter. If I play notes, they don't record. One thing I did notice, and sometimes this happens when you're looping, is that the last note that you play will occasionally bleed over onto the downbeat of the new loop that you played. So I'm just going to go ahead and make sure that didn't happen and delete it. We notice things a little bit off the grid. So we hit Command A, we hit Command U. Ooh, but what happened there? You'll notice, let me hit Command Z, undo. You notice this note right here? This note actually looks pretty good. It's right on the line. This note does the same thing. And then I hit Command U, and that is not what we want. We definitely don't want these notes overlapping. And what that means is we need to adjust the quantization settings. So let's go to Command Shift U. And we are set to eighth notes. And think back to what we said about subdivision. 1 and 2 and 3 and that's eighth notes right there. If we want to subdivide one more layer, we could say 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and evenly divide the time that way, which is what these notes are all trying to do. So we need to change the subdivision. Quantize 2. So let's try 16ths. That worked a lot better. Suddenly we have a pretty decent sounding 808 line, though it may be a bit loud, so I'm going to go ahead and bring it down. Don't forget too that we also have the simplified version and the ultra simplified version. Notice what just happened there though? They don't line up anymore because I was launching the clips and they're syncing with the downbeat, but if it syncs with the downbeat on, say, bar 3, the root note of the chord on bar 3 is F. And if this loop starts playing from its first bar, while this loop is still on its third bar, that F is not going to sound too good with this A. So you do want to make sure you're still counting and you're watching these little circles here to make sure that everything is actually in sync, especially if everything's the same length, right? Everything here is 4 bars. So we want to make sure that bar 1 is the same across each of them. So we're on our 4th bar, the next bar is bar 1, I can safely switch. Now I can't really safely switch until we get to the end again, or else we'll have that clash of notes. So that was making a bass line. Let's go ahead and add a melody on top of this beat.